There is a town in Pennsylvania where the ground beneath the streets has been burning for more than 60 years. Smoke has risen from the earth. The ground has cracked and collapsed, and beneath what remains of the town, an underground fire has continued moving through an abandoned coal mine. But Centralia was not always a ghost town. There was a time when hundreds of families lived here. Children went to school, people went to work, businesses opened their doors every morning, neighbors knew each other, and nobody imagined that one day most of the town would disappear. Centralia was born in Pennsylvania's coal country. Coal was more than a resource here. It was the reason the town existed. It provided jobs, it supported families, and it connected Centralia to the growing industrial economy of Pennsylvania. For generations, people went underground to mine the coal beneath their feet. The same coal that helped build the town would eventually become the reason people had to leave. By 1962, Centralia was still a normal American town. Roughly 1,100 people lived there. There were homes, stores, churches, schools, and businesses. People knew their neighbors. Children walked the same streets their parents had known for years. It was the reason the town existed. Nobody living there expected Centralia to become famous. And certainly nobody expected the town to disappear. In the spring of 1962, Centralia was preparing for Memorial Day. Like many small American towns, the community needed to deal with its garbage. An old strip mine pit near the town was being used as a dumping area. What happened there would change Centralia forever. On May 27, 1962, a fire was deliberately started to burn garbage in the pit. The plan seemed simple. Burn the trash, clean up the area, put out the fire, but the fire found something beneath the ground. Coal. The fire reached coal and entered the abandoned underground mine workings. What had started as a small surface fire was becoming something much more difficult to control. The flames were no longer only above the ground, they were moving beneath it. At first, officials believed the fire could be controlled. Workers dug trenches. Attempts were made to isolate the burning area. Government agencies studied different ways to extinguish the fire. But Centralia's underground mine system made the problem extraordinarily difficult. The fire had too many places to go. For years, Centralia continued living above the fire. People went to work. Children went to school. Families ate dinner in their homes. Cars drove through the streets. From the surface, much of the town looked normal. But beneath their feet, the fire was still burning. Then the warning signs became harder to ignore. Smoke began appearing in places where smoke should never have been. Gases escaped through cracks in the ground. The earth became unstable. For the people of Centralia, the underground fire was no longer something hidden beneath the town. It was beginning to come to the surface. By the early 1980s, the fire had been burning for nearly 20 years. The danger was becoming increasingly difficult to contain. And then, in 1981, something happened that shocks the entire community. A child nearly fell into the burning earth. On February 14, 1981, something happened that would shock Centralia. A 12-year-old boy named Todd Domboski was standing in his grandmother's backyard. Then the ground beneath him suddenly opened. Todd fell into a deep hole that had appeared without warning. The earth beneath Centralia was no longer simply burning, it was becoming dangerously unstable. Todd survived. But the incident revealed something terrifying. The ground beneath Centralia could collapse without warning. For the people who still lived there, the fire was no longer an invisible problem deep underground. It could now reach directly into their lives. The incident made national headlines. Centralia was no longer simply a small mining town with an old underground fire. It was becoming a place where homes, roads, and lives could be threatened by the burning ground beneath them. Officials had a difficult decision to make. Could Centralia be saved? Or would the people who lived there have to leave? For years, engineers and government officials had searched for a way to extinguish the fire. But Centralia's underground mine network was enormous. The fire could move through abandoned tunnels and coal seams beneath the surface. Stopping it completely would require enormous amounts of excavation and money. And even then, there was no guarantee that the fire could be completely extinguished. One possible solution involved digging out enormous quantities of earth to isolate the fire. Another option was to flood parts of the underground mine. But every proposal came with a massive price. By the early 1980s, officials were facing trying to save Centralia could cost far more than the town itself was worth. And there was another question. What about the people living there? By 1984, the situation had become impossible to ignore. The federal government approved millions of dollars to help acquire homes and relocate residents affected by the mine fire. For many people in Centralia, the decision was heartbreaking. They were not simply leaving a house, they were leaving a community, a place where their families had lived for generations, a place they had called home. The town did not disappear all at once. It happened one family at a time. One house was sold, then another. Some families left because they were afraid. Others left because they believed there was no future for the town. Moving away meant leaving behind neighbors, schools, churches, and memories. For some residents, that was harder than leaving the house itself. As more families left, the streets became quieter. Houses that had once been filled with laughter stood empty. Curtains disappeared from windows. Porches were abandoned. Driveways that once held family cars became overgrown. Centralia was slowly losing the people who had made it a town. Then, Centralia's problems reached one of the most important roads, Route 61. The ground beneath the road had become unstable because of the underground mine fire. Cracks appeared in the pavement. Sections of the roadway began to buckle. Eventually, the road had to be closed. For a town already losing its residents, losing its main road was another sign that Centralia's old life was coming to an end. By the end of the 1980s, Centralia had changed dramatically. Many buildings had been demolished. Many families had moved away. Streets that had once been busy were nearly empty. But the fire was still there. Beneath the abandoned homes and empty roads, the underground coal farm, Centralia was disappearing above ground, but beneath it, the fire was still alive. But not everyone wanted to leave. Some residents refused to abandon their homes. They had spent most of their lives in Centralia. Their families had lived there for generations. To them, the town was more than a collection of buildings. It was home, and they were not ready to give it up. For these residents, leaving was not a simple decision. Centralia had become more than an environmental disaster. It had become a fight over what it meant to lose your home. As the years passed, the empty spaces became larger. A house would disappear, then another. A familiar street would become a row of vacant lots. The town's population continued to shrink. Places where children had once played were becoming fields of grass and trees. Centralia was slowly being erased from the landscape. By the 1990s, Centralia no longer looked like the town people remembered. There were fewer houses, fewer cars, fewer people. The old rhythm of daily life had almost disappeared. What remained felt strangely quiet. And beneath that silence, the fire continued. The strange thing about Centralia was that the town was disappearing faster than the fire. People could leave, buildings could be demolished, roads could be closed, but the fire beneath the ground was much harder to stop. It continued moving through the old mine workings, slowly, silently, and almost completely out of sight. By the late 1990s, Centralia had become something few people could have imagined decades earlier. A town with almost no town left. Most of the houses were gone. Many streets were empty. Centralia was becoming a ghost town. What remained were fragments of the town that had once been there. An old house, a church, a street sign, a sidewalk leading nowhere. Pieces of Centralia survived among the empty land. Each one was a reminder that thousands of ordinary moments had once taken place here. One of the most visible reminders of Centralia's problems was Route 61. The road had once carried people through the town, but the ground beneath it became too unstable. The pavement cracked and buckled. Eventually, the road was abandoned. Today, an old section of Route 61 remains as a strange reminder of what happened beneath Centralia. Nature began taking back the places people had left behind. Grass covered old foundations. Trees grew where houses had once stood. The streets became quieter. And slowly, the landscape began hiding the evidence of the town that had existed there. Centralia was not simply being abandoned, it was being reclaimed by nature. The transformation was extraordinary. In 1962, Centralia had been home to roughly 1,100 people. Decades later, only a handful of residents remained. The community that had once supported hundreds of families had almost completely disappeared. Yet a few people still refused to leave. For them, Centralia, but there was one thing that had never left Centralia: the fire. More than 6 decades after it began, the underground mine fire was still burning. It had survived abandoned buildings. It had survived demolished streets. It had survived generations of people leaving the town. And beneath the ground, it continued moving through the old mine workings. Centralia may look peaceful from the surface, but the ground can be dangerous. The underground fire can produce hazardous gases. And abandoned mine workings can create areas where the ground becomes unstable. What looks like an ordinary patch of grass can conceal something much more dangerous beneath it. That is why Centralia is not simply an abandoned town waiting to be explored. The most dangerous areas are restricted. The ground can collapse, hazardous gases can accumulate, and the underground fire is still active. Centralia may look like a ghost town, but beneath that ghost town is an environmental hazard that never truly went away. Centralia left behind more than an underground fire. It left behind a lesson about the hidden consequences of America's industrial past. For generations, coal helped power homes, factories, and cities. It created jobs, it built communities, and it helped transform Pennsylvania. But when the mines were abandoned, for the people who once lived in Centralia, the story is not really about a ghost town. It is about home. It is about the streets where they grew up, the neighbors they knew, the schools their children attended, the houses where their families celebrated birthdays and holidays. Those memories did not disappear when the buildings were demolished. They simply became memories of a place that no longer looked the way they remembered it. If you stood in Centralia decades ago, you would have seen a very different place. You would have heard children playing, cars moving along the streets, miners coming home from work, neighbors talking on their porches. There were houses here, there were businesses, there were families. Today, much of that world is gone, but the land still remembers where it was. Centralia did not disappear in a single night. There was no single moment when the town suddenly became empty. It happened slowly. One family left, then another. A house was demolished, a road was closed, a neighborhood became an empty field. And after decades of change, the town that once held more than 1,000 people had almost completely disappeared. And yet, beneath all of it, the fire remained. More than 60 years after it began, the Centralia mine fire continued burning underground. The people left, the buildings disappeared, nature returned. But the fire continued through the abandoned mine workings beneath the earth. Centralia had lost its town, but it had never lost its fire. Centralia was never one of America's largest cities. It never became famous for skyscrapers or great monuments. It was simply a small Pennsylvania mining town. And perhaps that is why its story matters. Because history is not only made in famous places, it is also made in small towns, in communities that can disappear almost without the rest of the country noticing. Centralia reminds us that sometimes the most extraordinary stories come from the places we almost forget. Centralia was once a place where people built homes, raised children, and imagined their future. Today, most of that town is gone, but beneath the empty land, the fire continues. Still burning, still moving through the old mine workings, still reminding us of the town that once stood above it. A town built on coal, a town changed by fire, a town that slowly disappeared. Centralia, Pennsylvania, a forgotten town with a fire that never went away.